We live in a world of finite resources. We have the means to benefit people or to avert harm from them, but these resources are limited. Oftentimes, difficult choices have to be made between helping one group of people or another. What we will discuss today and continuing into our next lecture is what general guidance moral philosophy can offer us on how to make these choices and why. Specifically, we will ask, does it matter how many people will benefit if we help one group rather than the other? Now, as we saw in our very first lecture, consequentialism gives a very straightforward answer to this question. Consequentialism makes the right a function of the overall goodness of the outcome. How is this overall goodness to be determined? Well, consequentialists, especially classical utilitarians, endorse a thesis we labeled moral aggregation. According to this thesis, benefits and harms to different persons should be morally summed. We should do what produces the greatest net benefit in the aggregate. So, of course, the numbers matter to the consequentialist. All else equal, the more people you can benefit or spare from some harm, the more good you will be doing in the aggregate. And that is what you ought to do, according to the consequentialist. But as we will see in today's lecture, not all philosophers are convinced by this answer. The man whose paper we are discussing today is something of a legendary figure in moral philosophy, legendary in part for the unusual life he led. John Taurek was a one-hit wonder in the truest sense. The paper that we're discussing today, Should the Numbers Count, published in 1977, is in fact the only paper that Taurek ever published. He was at the time a young assistant professor at Stanford, and by all accounts an extreme perfectionist. Thomas Nagel, one of the editors of the journal Philosophy and Public Affairs, had to almost literally pry the paper from Taurek's hands to get it published. Sadly, when it came to Taurek's tenure case a few years later, the numbers did count, and he was denied tenure. Taurek then went off the grid. There were rumors that he was living in a trailer in the Arizona or Nevada desert, but we don't know this for sure. Later in life, it is thought that he worked as a lawyer, and he died in 2003. Taurek's paper, however, has been hugely influential, had a major afterlife. Indeed, it spawned a veritable cottage industry of papers on the topic of moral aggregation. Taurek's main thesis in his article is as simple as it is, to many people, counterintuitive. Here it is. In situations in which we face a choice between benefiting or preventing harm to two different groups of people, and no special considerations apply, we should not consider the relative numbers as something in itself significant in determining our course of action. Let's call this, for ease of future reference, Taurek's main thesis. So since, like many moral philosophers, Taurek has a flair for the dramatic, he illustrates his main thesis with a life and death scenario. Let's imagine, he says, that you have a sole dose of a scarce drug. You can either use it to save the life of one stranger, A, who needs the whole dose of the drug to survive, or you could use it to save 5 different strangers, persons B, C, D, E, and F, who each need only 1/5 the dose to survive. Now, by assumption, you have no other use for the drug. You don't need it for yourself, for example. So keeping the drug to yourself and saving no one is not morally an option, Taurek assumes. So, what ought you to do? If you do the former, A will live and the 5 will die. If you do the latter, A will die and the 5 will live. Let's call this case, for future reference, the basic case. So Taurek's main thesis applied to this basic case implies the following claim. There is no moral reason to give the drug to the 5 just because that way you would save a greater number of lives. Now, there's a common and pretty obvious objection to Taurek's thesis. It goes like this. But isn't it clear that the deaths of 5 persons would be a worse thing than the death of one? And isn't it clear for that reason that you have a moral obligation to save the lives of the 5 rather than the 1, at least absent special considerations? I'm sure that at least some of you watching at home had something like this reaction upon first reading Taurek's text. And you're in good company. This is, of course, exactly how a consequentialist would reason about Taurek's basic case. The rest of Taurek's article, then, is an attempt to persuade you that the consequentialist has got it wrong. Now, before we begin discussing the arguments of Taurek's paper, let me provide just a little philosophical context. Although Taurek doesn't put it in quite these terms, the sort of moral requirement that interests him in this article is usually termed a requirement of beneficence or charity in the literature. In the basic case that Taurek is discussing, a truly beneficent or charitable person will of course save someone. She wouldn't leave everyone to die. The question that Taurek is asking is whether the charity or beneficence that would lead such an agent to save someone or other, such a case, must also lead her to save the largest number, all else being equal. Now, Taurek's ultimate aim is to persuade you of a claim about the basic case. But he pursues this aim indirectly. The argumentative strategy he chooses in his paper has us first think about a different but related scenario. Imagine that you can either save the life of David, someone you know and like, as Taurek puts it, or the lives of 5 strangers. Let's call this case, for future reference, the David case. Taurek's intuition about the David case, which he expects many of his readers to share, is this. It would be permissible for you to save David rather than the 5 strangers. But if this is the right thing to say about the David case, Taurek reasons, we can draw certain conclusions about the basic case as well. Specifically, we ought to conclude that Taurek's main thesis is correct. We can see this, Taurek thinks, by reflecting more carefully on what possible justifications there might be for saving David rather than the 5 in the David case. Taurek rejects a number of possible explanations for why saving David rather than the 5 would be permissible. The reason you are permitted to save David rather than the 5, he reasons, couldn't be, for example, that David's death would be a worse outcome than the death of the 5. As Taurek writes on page 296, I would not think that the fact that David happens to be someone I know and like would make his death a worse thing in comparison to the death of these others than it would be if I didn't know him or knew him but happened not to like him. End quote. Nor does Taurek think is saving David permissible because you have some kind of special obligation to him as your friend. As he writes, such a supposition does not appear to capture my thinking at all. That's on page 297. Taurek points out that if he had a special obligation to David because he's his friend, he would be required and not merely permitted to save him rather than the 5. But this is not what he believes. He writes on page 297, the fact that I would act to save David's life because knowing him and liking him, my concern for his well-being is simply greater than my concern for the well-being of those others, not because I recognize some overriding obligation to him. So, having ruled out these possible explanations for why it's permissible to save David rather than the 5, that since he is your friend, his death would be a worse thing than the death of the 5, or that being your friend, you have a special obligation to David to save him. So, having ruled out these special considerations, Taurek thinks that we have shown that there are in fact no special considerations particular to the David case, which make it permissible to save David. In saving David, rather than the 5, you are in fact simply acting on a personal preference. Now, the fact that it is nonetheless intuitively permissible to save David shows that, in general, there is no moral requirement to save the 5 rather than the 1. So this is true even in the basic case, where all 6 people are strangers to you. Let's summarize this first argument of Taurek's using the technique of numbered propositions that we first encountered in Lecture 2. For ease of future reference, let's give a name to this argument. Let's call it simply the David argument. So Taurek's David argument, we will see, takes the form of what philosophers call a reductio ad absurdum argument. A reductio ad absurdum argument is a type of argument where you spell out the implausible implications of some claim in order to show that this claim cannot be true. So, in a reductio ad absurdum argument, we typically begin by assuming, for the sake of argument, the truth of some claim that we're actually going to try to disprove. Usually, this is the negation of the conclusion that we're trying to establish. We then proceed to show that this assumption cannot in fact be true because it would imply claims which we hold to be false. So here's how that looks in the case of the David argument. Taurek first assumes, for reductio, that absent special considerations, it is impermissible to save one person rather than 5. So this is the claim that Taurek is trying to disprove. If it were true, it would imply that in the basic case, you must save the greater number. So Taurek's aim is to show that proposition 1 is false. To do this, he first draws on our intuitions about a different case, the David case. He says about that case, this is proposition 2, intuitively, it is permissible to save a friend, David, rather than 5 strangers. Now, why would it be permissible to save David rather than the 5? Taurek's third claim is the one we were discussing a moment ago, proposition 3. The fact that David is a friend does not give rise to special considerations, he says. But now notice the following. Propositions 2 and 3 together logically contradict proposition 1. In other words, if propositions 2 and 3 are both true, 1 must be false. Hence, since we accept the truth of 2 and 3, we must conclude that proposition 1, which we assumed for the sake of refuting it, is in fact false. The upshot is that it is permissible to save 1 rather than 5, even absent special considerations. And that just is Taurek's main thesis. Right? So if this argument works, it has established the truth of Taurek's main thesis. All right. So having reconstructed Taurek's David argument and broken it down into premise-conclusion form, let us now examine it more closely to see if it is a sound argument. I think it's once again time for a little exercise in independent thinking. The two crucial premises in the David argument are, of course, propositions 2 and 3. So I would like you to pause the video and take the time to reflect on each of these propositions to see if you accept it. Is proposition 2 correct? Is it permissible to save your friend David rather than 5 strangers? What do you think? And what about proposition 3? Is Taurek right in claiming that the fact that David is a friend does not give rise to special considerations, such as, for example, a special obligation to rescue him? And do you think it matters in answering this question whether David is a close friend or perhaps just a friendly acquaintance? What if David was your brother? Would that give rise to special considerations? So take the time to think carefully about these questions. I'll see you on the other side. All right, welcome back. Well, let me give you my own take on the two questions I posed. But let me also stress that this is by no means the only way in which one might think about this case, right? I hope that goes without saying in philosophy. I think that how we should answer the two questions I posed is in fact not a straightforward matter. It is not straightforward because Taurek's David case is under-described in a crucial respect. Is David merely a friendly acquaintance, someone you casually know and like? Or is David a very old and close friend, someone who for you has almost the status of a sibling? Well, let's take Taurek's two claims about the David case, propositions 2 and 3, and see what we think of their truth if we first imagine one way of fleshing out the David case and then the other. So let's first suppose that David is merely a friendly acquaintance, a classmate at university, say, whom you like but don't know terribly well. Now, if that's how we're imagining the David case, then I think this makes proposition 3 pretty plausible. The mere fact that David is your friendly acquaintance does not give rise to any special moral considerations, we think. In particular, you're not under an obligation to save David rather than the 5 strangers. However, at the same time, imagining the David case this way makes proposition 2 appear less plausible, I think. It isn't so clear, at least to me, that if you want to, you can permissibly save David, who is merely a friendly acquaintance, rather than 5 other people. So, on this way of imagining the case, proposition 3 appears correct, but proposition 2 is in doubt. What if, by contrast, we imagine that David is a very close and dear friend? Well, now I think the opposite problem arises. If David is a very close friend, almost like a brother, that makes claim 2 very plausible. I think it's pretty intuitive that you're permitted to save David rather than the 5, just as many of us would think that you're permitted to save a sibling rather than 5 strangers. But the trouble is that now proposition 3 starts to look questionable. Is it really only optional to save David rather than the 5? Is this something you can do if you want to, but not something that you're required to do, we might wonder. Well, if we're imagining David as a very close friend, that might strike us as wrong. Again, what would you say if David were your brother? Don't you think you'd have a duty to save your brother, even if that meant allowing 5 strangers to die? Many philosophers think that we can have special obligations to our near and dear, that is, to people with whom we stand in special kinds of relationships. They believe that over and above the general duties that we owe to everyone in virtue of their simple humanity, participation in significant social groups or close personal relationships may in addition give rise to special duties, which act to strengthen our existing duties vis-à-vis members of these groups, or take the form of new duties not included in the set of our general duties. For instance, although I can be expected to bear some personal cost in order to provide assistance to strangers, we saw that in discussing Singer's pond case, for example, many of us believe that I'm required to bear greater costs to provide comparable assistance to my friend. I'd have to sacrifice far more than my shoes to rescue my friend if he's drowning in a pond. But if this is right, then perhaps claim 3 may now appear questionable. Is it really only optional to save David rather than the 5 if David is a very, very close friend? If the reason you're permitted to save David over the 5 is that you stand in this very close personal relationship with him, then wouldn't the existence of this relationship at the same time give you a duty to save David over the 5? But if you think that's true, then the fact that David is a friend does introduce special considerations, contra Taurek. So where does this leave us? I think that Taurek's David argument potentially trades on an ambiguity. Is David a close friend or merely a friendly acquaintance? If we resolve the ambiguity in one way, proposition 2 seems plausible. If we resolve it in another way, proposition 3 seems plausible. But it's not clear, at least to me, whether propositions 2 and 3 can both be correct at the same time. Okay, let's move on. Taurek has a second argument in support of his main thesis. I'll call this Taurek's argument from legitimate partiality. It can be found on page 301 of his article. Now, rather than me giving you my reconstruction of the argument right away, I'd like you to try and identify the argument for yourself and summarize it in a set of numbered propositions as we've been practicing. So please pause the video and give it a try. I'll be waiting for you. All right, welcome back. Taurek's second argument, what we will call his argument from legitimate partiality, begins by imagining a different scenario. Suppose, says Taurek, that the poor agent who must choose between the 1 and the 5 is actually himself the 1. So, for example, imagine that David owns all the drug himself and can save either himself by taking it, or he could give the drug to the 5 who each need 1/5 of the drug to survive and thereby save 5 lives. Taurek thinks that in this sort of case, it is natural to believe that, Proposition 1, if the choice were David's, he would be morally permitted to save his life rather than the lives of 5 strangers. The argument's second premise contains the key move of the argument. It goes as follows. What you are morally permitted to do for David must be the same as what David is permitted to do for himself. In other words, if David is morally permitted to use the life-saving drug on himself rather than giving it to the 5, then likewise it would be permissible for you to give the drug to David rather than giving it to the 5. From these two premises, we get the argument's conclusion. Therefore, you are permitted to save David rather than 5 strangers. Now, let's pause and examine this argument. It's clearly logically valid. But is it also sound? That is, are all its premises true? Well, the crucial premise, I said, is premise 2. What do you think? Should we accept this premise? Again, pause the video and think for yourself whether you can spot any potential problems with the claim that what you're morally permitted to do for David must be the same as what David is permitted to do for himself. Can you think of possible counterexamples to this claim? I'll wait for you. All right, welcome back. Well, what do we think of premise 2? Let's notice the following startling implication of the premise. It could likewise feature in a different argument. Let's call this the arm argument. So, suppose first that David could save the life of a stranger, but only at the cost of losing his arm. Would morality require David to sacrifice his arm to save the stranger, or would he be morally required not to make that choice? Many people would be inclined to say, if the choice were David's, he would be morally permitted to save his arm rather than the life of a stranger. Saving the life of a stranger at the cost of losing his arm would be praiseworthy for sure, even heroic. But a lot of us, I think, are inclined to view such an extreme sacrifice as supererogatory, as morally praiseworthy but not required. So let's take this as our first premise. Second, let's import premise 2 of the argument from legitimate partiality into the present argument, the arm argument. So premise 2 says, what you are morally permitted to do for David must be the same as what David is permitted to do for himself. Premises 1 and 2 then together give us the following conclusion. Therefore, you are permitted to save David's arm rather than the life of a stranger. Hang on, can that be right? If you could choose between saving one person's arm or another person's life, could you really permissibly choose to do the former? Now, Taurek himself embraces this implication of his legitimate partiality principle. But to many others, it will seem like a reductio ad absurdum of the principle, premise 2. Let's look at the first premise of the argument from legitimate partiality, the claim that if the choice were David's, he would be morally permitted to save his life rather than that of 5 strangers. Now, a committed act consequentialist would reject this premise. In the situation at hand, David could do the most good by saving the 5 at the cost of sacrificing himself. So this is what David ought to do, according to the act consequentialist. But of course, not all of us are act consequentialists. I want to distinguish two different reasons why, against the act consequentialist, we might accept premise 1. The first is that we may believe that there exist what the philosopher Samuel Scheffler calls agent-centered prerogatives. That is, we may believe that it is sometimes permissible to give priority to your own well-being, even if this produces an outcome that is worse overall. In deliberating how to act, you can attach a kind of multiplier to your own self-interest. Now, the thought that there are agent-centered prerogatives of this sort is very widespread among non-consequentialist philosophers. For a much fuller discussion, I recommend to you Scheffler's 1982 book, The Rejection of Consequentialism. Okay, but now let's notice the following. If our reason for endorsing premise 1 of the argument from legitimate partiality is that we accept this idea of agent-centered prerogatives, this actually undermines the case for premise 2, the claim that what you are morally permitted to do for David must be the same as what David is permitted to do for himself. Why would that be? Well, think about it. If David has an agent-centered prerogative, it is precisely the case that he is permitted to be more partial to himself than you are permitted to be towards him. So if that's right, premise 2 is in fact false. But there is a different reason why we might accept premise 1. We might challenge the act consequentialist not on whether you're always morally required to do what will produce the best consequences, even at great personal sacrifice, but rather on the idea that David saving the 5 at the cost of his own life would in fact produce the best consequences. Instead, we might reason as follows. While different outcomes affecting different sets of people may be better or worse for the respective people they affect, we cannot really say that one outcome is better simpliciter or better full stop. There is no such thing as the impersonal value of an outcome, that is, the value that it has independently of the value that it has for particular people. There is only the value that it has for or from the perspective of various affected individuals. Now, as for people who are not affected by either outcome, bystander, you in the basic case, well, these people have the right to evaluate the value of an outcome from whichever individual perspective they so choose, by sympathetically identifying, stepping into the shoes of the person concerned. And this, in fact, is exactly what Taurek believes. Saving David rather than the 5 isn't just permissible, it isn't a worse outcome either, he asserts. As Taurek argues on page 307, quote, should any of these 5 lose his life, his loss is no greater a loss to him because, as it happens, 4 others, or 49 others, lose their lives as well. And neither he nor anyone else loses anything of greater value to him than does David, should David lose his life. 5 individuals, each losing his life, does not add up to anyone's experiencing a loss 5 times greater than the loss suffered by any one of the 5. Should we be persuaded by Taurek's reasoning in this passage? Well, Taurek is of course right that when 5 people experience a loss rather than David experiencing a loss of the same size, there isn't someone whose loss is 5 times greater than that of David. Groups of people, after all, aren't some kind of super individual. But still, we might think, there are 5 people experiencing a loss rather than just a single person. Why can't this make the former outcome worse than the latter? Now, granted, it wouldn't make it worse for any one of the 5. But must all claims about goodness be perspectival in this way? Compare another case. 5 people each experiencing a minor headache. Well, this isn't the same as one person experiencing a migraine, right? The headaches don't add up into someone experiencing a migraine. Nonetheless, isn't there more pain when 5 people experience a minor headache rather than just a single person experiencing a minor headache? And couldn't this make it a worse state of affairs, we might wonder? So, for example, if you previously believed that only one person was suffering a headache, Wouldn't it be bad news to learn that the number of people suffering a headache was 5, not 1? We've critically examined Taurek's case for his main thesis, that in situations in which we face a choice between benefiting or preventing harm to two different groups of people, and no special considerations apply, we should not consider the relative numbers as something in itself significant in determining our course of action. Simply saving the larger number, Taurek writes on page 315, would not, quote, reflect an equal concern for the survival of each. It would be like giving priority to the rich. So what then ought we to do, according to Taurek, if not save the larger number? Well, he doesn't go into too much detail in his paper, but he does suggest that, to show equal concern for each person, we ought perhaps to simply flip a coin to decide whether to save the larger or the smaller group. In this way, Taurek reasons, everyone, both the 5 and the 1, has an equal 50% chance of having their life saved. I want to conclude today's lecture by reflecting with you on whether that's right. Is Taurek correct that giving each an equal chance of survival is what is required to show equal concern for each? Some philosophers, and not just consequentialists, disagree with this. Let's consider the take of Francis Cam, a brilliant non-consequentialist philosopher and one of my former teachers at Harvard. In volume 1 of her book Morality, Mortality, Francis Cam writes, quote, in a conflict case involving unequal numbers, each of whose life is at stake, justice demands that each person on one side should have her interests balanced against those of one person on the opposing side. Those whose interests are not balanced out in the larger group help to determine that the larger group should be saved. Those who are balanced out in the larger group are saved instead of those in the smaller group. So let's make this completely concrete. Imagine that we must choose between saving either A's life or saving the lives of B and C. So Cam's procedure then tells us to balance A's claim with B's claim. These two claims cancel each other out. Okay, but that leaves C's unbalanced claim. And it is this claim which decides what we ought to do, namely to save B and C. Now, according to Cam, simply flipping a coin to determine whether to save A or B and C, as Taurek recommends, this would be unjust because it fails to take into account that alongside B, C also has an independent interest in being saved. Flipping a coin is what you might do in a 1 versus 1 case, where you could save either A or B, and their claims are equally balanced. But also flipping a coin in the present 1 versus 2 case, according to Cam, would fail to give any moral weight to the presence of this additional person C. It would treat the case of A versus B and C just like the case of A versus B alone. But that's unjust to C. It treats her as if she didn't matter in her own right. So, against Taurek, Cam believes that the way in which we show equal and appropriate concern to each person in a situation like the basic case is not by giving each person an equal chance in some survival lottery, but rather by counting each person's interest in survival equally, as mattering in its own right. But that, she thinks, favors saving the greater number. We can summarize the appeal of this view in a slogan. Each person matters equally. That is why more people matter more.